In this module, we'll be discussing two major topics. The first one will be dynamics of the pen, and under this topic, I'll show you how to hold the pen depending on your dominant hand. We'll also build on some core competencies on how to keep your hand sturdy and also write with a consistent angle. Our second discussion will be around scaling and measurements. And in this topic, essentially we'll be discussing on how to write calligraphy in the proper proportions. If you're a right-handed individual, you'll be holding the qalam about 1.5 inches from the tip, and the hollow part would be facing downwards. Now, make sure that your wrist is absolutely sturdy, and the reason for this is that we want the entire chisel tip to be on the surface of the paper at all times. If there's any play whatsoever, you'll see that the pen would lift and the angle would be inconsistent. If you're left-handed like myself, this is how you'll be holding the qalam. Again, there should be no play whatsoever in the wrist, and you should produce a consistent angle. So something of this nature, where you'd be moving your hand and your wrist, would really ruin your calligraphic work. So make sure that none of this is happening during your scripting. Once you've practiced keeping your hand sturdy and keeping the entire chisel tip on the surface of the paper at all times, it's time to practice holding the qalam in the appropriate angle. Now, the angle would vary depending on the script that you're writing. And for nasakh and thuluth, the angle would be anywhere between 50 and 60 degrees. So if I was to script a shape like this, you'll notice that the thickness is at full play as I go up. And as I come down, you'll notice that the stroke is at its thinnest. Now I'll repeat this shape again. So as I go up, you'll notice that the stroke is at its thickest. Reload some more ink here. And as I come down, the stroke is at its thinnest. Let's practice this one more time. As we go up, the stroke is thick. And as you can see, I'm having some ink issues here. And again, as I come down, the stroke would be at its thinnest. Now, what I advise you doing is practice this several times on several sheets of paper, just so you can master the angle at which you should be scripting nasakh and thuluth. Now, notice that these angles are not 45 degrees. They are actually anywhere between 50 and 60 degrees, as I had previously mentioned. So if I was to actually make a right angle triangle here, you'd see that both sides, or the sides of the triangle, are actually not the same length. Now, let's spend a little bit of time discussing the concept of scaling and measurements, which is essentially a backbone to this course, and it is absolutely critical for you to understand this with complete thoroughness in order to succeed at scripting good calligraphy. Now, as you can see, I've written the letter ta twice here, and I wanted to point out 3 key differences between these 2 letters. The first difference is the obvious one, the size difference. The second difference is the difference in the thickness of the strokes between the 2 letters. So the strokes in the smaller ta are thinner, and the strokes in the larger ta are thicker. Last, but by no means the least, and really the topic of our next discussion, The last difference is the size difference between the nuqtas of the two tas. So as you can see, the smaller ta has smaller nuqtas and the larger ta has larger nuqtas. Now, the nuqta is essentially the base unit that we'll be using for all of our scaling and measurements when writing calligraphy. We do not measure letters based on inches and centimeters because it is all relative depending on the thickness of the chisel tip instrument that you're using to write calligraphy. So essentially, if you're using a thicker chisel tip instrument, then naturally the nuqtas will be larger and consequently the size of the letter would be bigger. On the other hand, if you're using a thinner chisel tip instrument, then your nuqtas would be smaller and the overall size of your letters would be smaller. Now, for all those individuals that I've managed to confuse by now, I'm going to use Mr. Dad here as an example to show you how to use the rules of scaling and measurements. So if we use the nuqta to measure the strokes of the Dad, we will notice that the loop of the Dad measures 4 nuqtas by 2.5 nuqtas. Now, if we were to script a Dad using a thinner chisel tip instrument, those proportions, the 4 dots by 2.5 dots, is not going to change. So even though the size of the Dad would be smaller, the overall proportions would be exactly the same. Now, all this conversation going around about the nuqta being the base unit for all scaling and measurements, let us briefly have a closer look at what the nuqta actually looks like. Now, as you probably already guessed, the nuqta is far more than just a dot. Okay. Now, in order to script the perfect nuqta that is appropriate for all of your measurements, it is important that this looks like a perfect diamond. Okay. Now, a perfect diamond really is a square that is on a 45-degree rotation. So if I was to make a bigger box around this nuqta, you'll see that all of these segments on the side are equal, which means that this nuqta is accurate. Now, some of my beginner students get in the habit of scripting the nuqta like this, or perhaps something like this. And though they're great attempts, they have to follow 2 criteria. One, all of the sides have to be of equal length, and that they have to be on a 45-degree rotation. So it has to be a diamond shape. So these 2 figures would be incorrect, and please make sure that you script the nuqta like this. Now, as we go along in the course, you'll see me use a circle as part of the measurements from time to time. And what this really means is that the measurement is about half the size of a nuqta. So, for example, if you were to see a measurement that was 3 nuqtas with a circle beside it, what this really means is that the measurement is 3.5 nuqtas. In conclusion, I'd like to point out that as important as it is to understand the concept of scaling and measurements, and to adhere to these rules, especially while learning, these are merely guidelines to help you out, rather than rules written in stone. If a shape is, say, 7 nuqtas wide, and you ended up creating the shape 8 nuqtas wide, then that is okay. You are allowed to be off by about a nuqta, or even nuqta and a half, so no need to be extremely rigid on your scaling and measurements, but know them in the back of your head and try to be as close as you possibly can be.